She stepped off the train in Montana with nothing but a wool coat, a Norwegian prayer book, and a marriage contract written in a language she barely understood. The man waiting for her looked nothing like his photograph, rougher, wilder, more dangerous than any Bergen fisherman she'd ever known. But when the worst blizzard in 20 years trapped them together, Astrid Larsen would discover that survival had its own language, and love needed no translation at all. The wind off the North Sea carried the scent of salt and sorrow as it whipped through the narrow streets of Bergen, Norway. October of 1884 had been brutal to the fishing families of the old city, and none had felt its bite more keenly than the Larsen household on Strandgaten Street. Astrid Larsen pressed her face against the frost-covered window of their tiny apartment, watching the harbor where her father's boat should have been. Should have been, but never would be again. 3 months had passed since the storm that claimed Lars Larsen and 5 other fishermen, and the absence of his weathered hands and booming laugh had left more than just an emotional void in their lives. It had left them starving. "Astrid," came the weak voice from the bed behind her. "Come away from the window, Kiara. The cold will make you sick." Astrid turned to look at her mother, Ingrid Larsen, whose once robust frame had shrunk to little more than bones wrapped in faded wool. The consumption had been eating at her lungs for months now, made worse by the poor nutrition and drafty rooms they could barely afford. At 42, Ingrid looked like a woman of 60, her blonde hair gone gray and thin, her blue eyes hollow with the kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't cure. "More," Astrid said softly, using the Norwegian word for mother that felt like a prayer on her lips. "I was just watching for the mail." It wasn't entirely a lie. She had been watching for the mail, though not for any ordinary correspondence. For weeks now, she had been exchanging letters with the American Marriage Bureau, a service that connected European women with frontier men seeking wives. It was a desperate measure, one that made her stomach twist with anxiety every time she thought about it. But desperation had become their closest companion since Lars's death. In the corner of the room, her younger siblings huddled together for warmth. Eric, at 15, was old enough to work, but too young to find employment that paid enough to feed 4 people. At 12, little Greta still asked when Papa was coming home, as if his death were just an extended fishing trip, and baby Thomas, barely 2 years old, cried constantly from hunger that their meager meals could never fully satisfy. The sound of footsteps on the wooden stairs outside their door made Astrid's heart leap. She hurried to open it before the visitor could knock, not wanting to wake Thomas, who had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep. "Miss Larsen?" The postal worker, a thin man with kind eyes, held out an envelope. "From America." Astrid's hands trembled as she accepted the letter, noting the unfamiliar handwriting and the strange stamps. "Tusen takk," she whispered in Norwegian, then caught herself. "Thank you." She waited until the postal worker's footsteps faded down the stairs before closing the door and examining the envelope more closely. The return address read, "Caleb Morrison, Copper Creek, Montana Territory, United States of America." This was it, the response she had been waiting for, the one that could change everything or confirm that their situation was truly hopeless. "What is it, Kiara?" Ingrid asked, struggling to sit up in bed. "A letter from America, Moore. From the man who—" Astrid hesitated, still not sure how to explain what she was planning to do. "From the man who might marry me." Ingrid's eyes widened, and for a moment, something like her old strength flickered across her face. "Show me." Astrid sat on the edge of the bed and carefully opened the envelope, unfolding a single sheet of paper covered in neat English handwriting. Her English was limited. She had learned some from the British sailors who came to Bergen's harbor, but she could make out enough to understand the general meaning. "Dear Miss Larsen," she read aloud, translating as best she could into Norwegian for her mother's benefit. "Thank you for your letter and photograph. I was very pleased to receive both. I am writing to formally request your hand in marriage and to provide you with the information you requested about my circumstances here in Montana Territory." She paused, scanning ahead to make sure she understood the next part correctly. "I own a ranch of 640 acres in the Copper Creek Valley, with approximately 200 head of cattle and 50 horses. The ranch house is modest but comfortable, with 4 rooms and a stone fireplace. I have lived here for 6 years and have built a good reputation in the community as a reliable and honest man. Ingrid gripped Astrid's arm. Keep reading. As we discussed in our previous correspondence, I am seeking a wife for companionship and to help manage the household. I understand that you have family obligations in Norway, and I want to assure you that once we are married and you are established here, I will do everything in my power to help you bring your family to America as well. Astrid's voice caught on that last part. The possibility of bringing her family to safety in America had been the main reason she had contacted the Marriage Bureau in the first place. If this man, this Caleb Morrison, was telling the truth, it could mean salvation for all of them. There's more, she said, continuing to read. I have enclosed money for your passage to Montana Territory, as well as funds for any necessities you might need for the journey. If you agree to this arrangement, please send word as soon as possible. The winter travel season will be upon us soon, and I would prefer that you arrive before the heavy snows make travel more difficult. At the bottom of the letter was a formal proposal. Miss Astrid Larson, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? It was signed simply, yours respectfully, Caleb Morrison. Tucked behind the letter was a bank draft for an amount that made Astrid gasp. More money than her father had earned in 3 months of good fishing. Enough to buy her passage to America, with plenty left over to keep her family fed and housed through the winter. And there was something else, a photograph. The image was formal, clearly taken in a photographer's studio. It showed a man who appeared to be in his late 20s, with dark hair neatly combed and a serious expression. He wore a clean white shirt and dark jacket, and his hands were folded in his lap in a pose that spoke of careful preparation for the camera. His face was pleasant enough, strong jaw, intelligent eyes, no obvious defects or signs of cruelty. But it was just a photograph. Astrid had heard enough stories about correspondence, marriages to know that pictures could lie, that men could present themselves as one thing in letters and photographs, while being something entirely different in person. He looks like a good man, Ingrid said, studying the image over Astrid's shoulder. Strong, responsible. Pictures can deceive more, Astrid replied, though she found herself hoping this one didn't. So can staying here, Ingrid said bluntly. Look around you, Kiara. Look at your brothers and sister. How long do you think we can survive like this? Astrid didn't answer because they both knew the truth. Without Lars's income from fishing, and with Ingrid too sick to work, they were slowly starving. Eric did what he could, taking odd jobs around the harbor when they were available. But it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. And winter was coming. In Bergen, winter meant even fewer work opportunities, higher costs for fuel and food, and the constant threat of illness that their weakened bodies might not be able to fight off. Last winter, with Lars still alive and working, they had barely scraped by. This winter would likely kill them. What does your heart tell you? Ingrid asked gently. Astrid looked at the photograph again, trying to imagine what this Caleb Morrison might be like in person. Was he kind? Patient? Would he understand that she was sacrificing everything familiar for the slim hope of building something better? Would he be gentle with a woman who spoke his language poorly and knew nothing about American ways? My heart is scared, she admitted, but my heart also knows that scared and dead are not the same thing. Ingrid smiled, the first real smile Astrid had seen from her in weeks. Then you will go. I will write to him tonight, Astrid said, folding the letter carefully, and I will use some of this money to make sure you and the children are provided for while I am gone. No, Ingrid said firmly. You will use that money to start your new life properly. We will manage here until you can send for us. But more, listen to me, Astrid Elisabeth Larson. Ingrid's voice carried the authority of a mother who would not be argued with. You are our hope now. You are the one who must be strong enough to build a bridge between our old life and our new one. That bridge will not be built if you arrive in America poor and desperate. Astrid felt tears sting her eyes. What if I fail? What if he is not what he seems? What if America is not what I hope? Then you will adapt, Ingrid said simply. You are Bergen-born, raised on storms and salt air. You have survived 19 Norwegian winters and learned to find food when there was none and warmth when the world was ice. Whatever America throws at you, it cannot be worse than watching your family waste away from hunger. That night, Astrid sat at their small wooden table, writing by candlelight while her family slept around her. The letter she composed was formal and careful, written in her best English. Dear Mr. Morrison, I am honored by your proposal and accept your offer of marriage. I will arrange to travel to Montana Territory as soon as possible and will send word of my travel plans once they are confirmed. I want to thank you for your generosity regarding my family situation, and I hope that I will prove worthy of the trust you are placing in me. I look forward to meeting you and beginning our life together. Yours sincerely, Astrid Larson. It was a businesslike response to a businesslike proposal, but as she signed her name, Astrid found herself wondering if there might be room for something more than business between them. Love, perhaps, though she hardly dared hope for it. Friendship, at least. Mutual respect and kindness. She folded the letter and set it aside to post in the morning, then sat for a long time looking out the window at the lights of Bergen Harbor. Somewhere across an ocean she had never seen, in a land she could barely imagine, a man named Caleb Morrison was waiting for her arrival. In 3 weeks, if the schedules worked out as planned, she would be his wife. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, as she listened to her family's quiet breathing and felt the cold mountain wind rattling their windows, Astrid Larson felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. 2 weeks later, Astrid stood on the dock at Bergen Harbor, clutching a small leather suitcase that contained everything she owned. The steamship Norwegian Star loomed before her, its smokestacks already belching black clouds into the gray October sky. Other passengers milled around the dock, some excited, some tearful, all carrying the particular mixture of fear and anticipation that marked people leaving everything familiar behind. Her family had come to see her off, though the sight of them nearly broke her resolve. Ingrid could barely stand, leaning heavily on Eric's arm, but she had insisted on being there. Little Greta clung to Astrid's skirt, not understanding why her big sister was leaving, and Thomas, too young to comprehend what was happening, kept reaching for her with chubby hands and babbling, "Asta, Asta," in his limited vocabulary. "The money I left will last you through spring," Astrid said to Eric, speaking in Norwegian so the family could understand every word. "Be careful with it. Make sure Moore sees the doctor when she needs to, and keep Greta and Thomas warm." Eric, trying to be brave but failing to hide his fear, nodded. "What if we don't hear from you? What if something happens?" "You will hear from me," Astrid promised. "As soon as I can, I will write. And as soon as it is possible, I will send for you. All of you." "What if this man is not good to you?" Greta asked, her blue eyes wide with worry. Astrid knelt down to her sister's level, smoothing the child's blonde hair. "Then I will make the best of it anyway, because that is what we do. We survive, and we take care of each other, no matter what." The ship's whistle blew, a long, mournful sound that seemed to echo across the entire harbor. Other passengers began moving toward the gangplank, and Astrid knew her time for goodbyes was running out. She kissed each family member, holding them tight and whispering words of love and encouragement. When she came to her mother, Ingrid pressed something into her hands, a small wooden cross that had belonged to Astrid's grandmother. "For luck," Ingrid whispered, "and to remember that you carry all of us with you, wherever you go." Astrid tucked the cross into her coat pocket, where she could feel its weight against her heart. Then, before her courage could fail her, she picked up her suitcase and walked toward the ship. The journey across the Atlantic took 9 days, though it felt like 9 years. Astrid traveled in steerage, packed into the ship's lower decks with dozens of other emigrants seeking new lives in America. The conditions were cramped and often unpleasant, but she had endured worse during Bergen's coldest winters. She spent most of the voyage on deck when the weather permitted, watching the endless expanse of gray water and trying to imagine what her new life would be like. Other passengers shared stories and rumors about America, some encouraging, some frightening. There were tales of vast fortunes made and lost, of Indian attacks and gold strikes, of cities that grew from nothing into thriving metropolises in the span of a few years. But it was the stories about the American frontier that fascinated Astrid most. The idea of wide open spaces, of land that stretched to the horizon without a single building or fence, was almost impossible for someone raised in crowded Bergen to comprehend. In Norway, every piece of useful land had been claimed and worked for generations. The concept of a place where a person could simply stake a claim and build a new life from scratch was both thrilling and terrifying. She also spent time practicing her English with other passengers who spoke the language. A German family bound from Minnesota had a daughter who had learned English in school, and she was happy to help Astrid improve her pronunciation and grammar. An Irish man traveling to work in the coal mines of Pennsylvania corrected her accent and taught her American idioms that wouldn't be found in any textbook. By the time the ship reached New York Harbor, Astrid felt more confident about her ability to communicate, though she knew she still had much to learn. The sight of the Statue of Liberty rising from New York Harbor brought tears to her eyes, not just because of its symbolic meaning, but because it meant the ocean crossing was finally over. America lay before her, vast and unknown and full of possibilities. From New York, she took a train to Chicago, then another train to St. Paul, Minnesota, and finally a smaller line that carried her across the Dakota Territory and into Montana. Each mile took her farther from everything she had ever known and closer to a future she could only guess at. The landscape changed dramatically as she traveled west. The green farmlands of the east gave way to rolling prairies, then to more rugged terrain marked by buttes and mesas. By the time the train began its approach to Copper Creek, Montana Territory, the scenery was unlike anything Astrid had ever seen. Vast open spaces under enormous skies, mountains rising like jagged teeth on the horizon, and a sense of isolation that was both beautiful and intimidating. As the train pulled into the small station at Copper Creek, Astrid felt her heart begin to race. Somewhere on the platform waiting for her was Caleb Morrison, the man who would become her husband in a matter of days. She gathered her belongings, said goodbye to the fellow passengers who had become friends during the long journey, and stepped off the train into her new life. The platform was small and mostly empty, with only a few people waiting for arriving passengers or preparing to board for the journey east. Astrid looked around nervously, clutching her suitcase and trying to spot someone who resembled the man in the photograph. "Miss Larson?" She turned toward the voice and found herself face to face with a tall man in work clothes and a wide-brimmed hat. For a moment, she didn't recognize him. This man was broader in the shoulders than the person in the photograph, his skin more weathered, his hands obviously calloused from hard work. But when he removed his hat, revealing dark hair and the same intelligent eyes she remembered from the picture, she realized this was indeed Caleb Morrison. "Yes," she said, her English feeling clumsy on her tongue. "I am Astrid Larson." He smiled, and the expression transformed his face from merely pleasant to genuinely warm. "Welcome to Montana Territory, Miss Larson. I hope your journey wasn't too difficult." "It was long," she said, searching for the right words, "but not so bad. The ship was rough, but the train was better." Caleb reached for her suitcase. "Here, let me take that. My wagon's just outside. I thought we could go to the hotel first, get you settled and fed, and then we can talk about the wedding arrangements." As they walked toward the station exit, Astrid found herself stealing glances at her future husband. He was taller than she had expected. She was not a small woman at 5 feet 6 inches, but he stood several inches above her. His clothes were clean but clearly well worn, and everything about him spoke of a man who worked with his hands for a living. Most surprising of all, he seemed nervous, which somehow made her feel less nervous herself. "I should warn you," he said as they stepped outside into the crisp mountain air. "I'm not much for fancy words or social graces. I hope that won't be a problem." Astrid looked at him, noting the genuine concern in his expression. "I am not fancy person either," she replied. "In Bergen we work hard and speak simple. Maybe that is good." He smiled again. "I think it might be." The wagon was sturdy but simple, pulled by 2 well-fed horses that looked strong enough to handle the rough mountain terrain. Caleb helped her up onto the seat, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. As they drove through the small town of Copper Creek, Astrid took in her surroundings with intense curiosity. The buildings were mostly wood-frame structures, functional rather than beautiful, but everything looked clean and well-maintained. There was a general store, a saloon, a church with a small bell tower, and what appeared to be a schoolhouse. People on the street turned to look at them as they passed, and Astrid could see curiosity and assessment in their faces. Is very small town, she observed. About 200 people, Caleb confirmed. Not much like a big city, I imagine. Will that bother you? Astrid considered this. Bergen has many people, but I know only few. Maybe small town is better. You know everyone, and everyone knows you. That can be good and bad, Caleb said with a laugh. Sometimes knowing everyone means everyone knows your business too. They pulled up in front of a two-story building with a sign that read Mountain View Hotel. It was modest but appeared clean and respectable. I've arranged for you to have a room here tonight, Caleb explained as he helped her down from the wagon. Tomorrow we can be married, if that suits you, and then you can come out to the ranch. Astrid nodded, though the reality of getting married to this man she had just met was beginning to sink in. That is good. I would like to wash and rest before wedding. Of course. Caleb retrieved her suitcase and led her into the hotel lobby. Mrs. Patterson here will take good care of you, and I'll come by in the morning, maybe around 10 o'clock, to escort you to the church. Yes, that is good, Astrid replied, though she was beginning to feel overwhelmed by the strangeness of everything. The accents, the architecture, the dry mountain air that was so different from Bergen's humid sea breeze. Mrs. Patterson, the hotel proprietor, was a matronly woman with kind eyes who immediately took Astrid under her wing. You poor dear, you must be exhausted after such a long journey. Let's get you upstairs and settled, and I'll bring you some hot water for washing and a good meal. As Caleb prepared to leave, he paused and looked at Astrid with an expression that seemed part concern, part hope. Miss Larson, I want you to know that I'll do my best to be a good husband to you. I know this is all very strange and new, but I hope we can make a good life together. The simple sincerity in his voice touched something in Astrid's chest. I hope so too, Mr. Morrison. I will try to be a good wife. After he left, Mrs. Patterson showed Astrid to a small but comfortable room on the second floor. It had a real bed with clean sheets, a washstand with a mirror, and a window that looked out over the town's main street toward the mountains beyond. You're a brave girl, Mrs. Patterson said, as she helped Astrid unpack her few belongings. Coming all this way to marry a man you've never met, that takes courage. Or desperation, Astrid replied, then immediately worried that she had said too much. But Mrs. Patterson just smiled. Sometimes those are the same thing, dear. And sometimes desperate people make the best choices because they don't have the luxury of being picky. That evening, as Astrid lay in the unfamiliar bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of an American frontier town, she thought about the strange journey that had brought her here. 3 months ago, she had been just another fisherman's daughter in Bergen, worried about nothing more serious than whether the herring would run well that season. Now she was about to marry a stranger in a place she had never heard of, and somehow build a life from nothing but hope and determination. Tomorrow she would become Mrs. Caleb Morrison. The thought should have terrified her, but as she drifted off to sleep, Astrid found herself feeling something she hadn't experienced since before her father died. Anticipation. The church bell in Copper Creek rang 10 times as Astrid made her final preparations for her wedding day. She had woken before dawn, too nervous to sleep, and spent the early morning hours walking around the small room, practicing the English phrases she would need for the ceremony. I, Astrid, take you, Caleb, to be my husband, she whispered to the mirror above the washstand, trying to get the pronunciation exactly right. The words felt strange on her tongue, formal and foreign, but she was determined not to stumble over them during the actual ceremony. Mrs. Patterson had been incredibly kind, helping her prepare for the wedding with an attention to detail that reminded Astrid painfully of her mother. The hotel proprietor had pressed Astrid's best dress, a deep blue wool garment that her mother had helped her sew for special occasions, and had even produced a small bouquet of late-season wildflowers. You look lovely, dear, Mrs. Patterson said, as she made final adjustments to Astrid's hair, arranging it in a style that was fashionable in America, but still felt natural to a Norwegian girl. Mr. Morrison is a lucky man. Astrid studied her reflection critically. She had inherited her mother's blonde hair and blue eyes, and the long journey from Bergen had given her cheeks a healthy color that offset the pallor she had developed during the difficult months after her father's death. She was not beautiful in the dramatic way of the actresses whose photographs sometimes appeared in the European newspapers, but she was pleasant-looking and healthy, and she hoped that would be enough. "I hope he thinks so," she said quietly. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Patterson opened it to reveal Caleb Morrison, dressed in his finest clothes, a dark suit that looked relatively new, and a white shirt that was obviously freshly pressed. His hair was neatly combed, and he had shaved recently enough that Astrid could smell the bay rum cologne from across the room. But even dressed up for his wedding, he looked more rugged than the man in the photograph she had first seen. The formal studio portrait had captured his features, but not the weathered quality of his skin or the calluses on his hands that spoke of years of physical labor. This was clearly a man who worked outdoors for a living, who was more comfortable with horses and cattle than with formal social occasions. "Miss Larson," he said, removing his hat as he entered the room, "you look beautiful." The compliment was simple and seemed genuine, which somehow made it more meaningful than flowery phrases might have been. "Thank you, Mr. Morrison. You look very nice also." An awkward silence fell between them, broken only when Mrs. Patterson clapped her hands together. "Well then, we should get you two to the church before Reverend Williams thinks you've changed your minds." The walk to the church was short, but felt interminable to Astrid. People stopped what they were doing to watch them pass, and she could hear whispered conversations in her wake. Some of the attention seemed friendly and curious, but she also detected undertones of skepticism and judgment that made her uncomfortable. "They wonder about the foreign girl," she said quietly to Caleb as they approached the church steps. "Let them wonder," he replied firmly. "This is a small town where everyone knows everyone else's business. A new person always causes talk. It will die down once they get used to you." The church was small but well-maintained, with simple wooden pews and clear glass windows that let in the bright mountain sunlight. Reverend Williams was a middle-aged man with a kind face and a gentle manner that immediately put Astrid more at ease. The ceremony itself was brief and simple. Besides the Reverend, the only witnesses were Mrs. Patterson and a man Caleb introduced as his neighbor, Tom Bradley. Astrid managed to speak her vows clearly, though she could hear her Norwegian accent making the English words sound unfamiliar, even to her own ears. When Caleb slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, the reality of what they were doing finally hit her. She was married now, legally bound to this man she had known for less than 24 hours. The ring felt strange and heavy on her finger, a constant reminder of how much her life had just changed. "You may kiss the bride," Reverend Williams announced with a smile. Caleb leaned down and pressed his lips to hers briefly and gently. It was her first kiss from a man who wasn't related to her, and while it was pleasant enough, it felt more like sealing a contract than expressing affection. As they signed the marriage certificate, Astrid noticed that Caleb's handwriting was neat and confident. He was clearly an educated man, which was reassuring. Her own signature looked foreign next to his, the Norwegian characters of her name standing out starkly against the English document. "Well, Mrs. Morrison," Caleb said as they left the church, "would you like to see your new home?" Mrs. Morrison. The name felt as strange as the ring on her finger. "Yes, I would like that very much." The wagon ride to the ranch took about an hour through countryside that was unlike anything Astrid had ever seen. The landscape was vast and open, with rolling hills covered in brown grass and punctuated by stands of pine and aspen trees. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks already dusted with early snow that gleamed white against the deep blue sky. "It's very big," Astrid said, struggling to find the right English word to express the sense of space that was both exhilarating and intimidating. 640 acres, Caleb confirmed. "When I first came here, I could ride for an hour in any direction without seeing another soul. It's gotten a bit more populated since then, but it's still pretty isolated." "You like the alone?" Caleb considered this. "I like the quiet, and I like knowing that what I build here is mine, that I'm not dependent on anyone else for my livelihood." He glanced at her. "Does the isolation worry you?" Astrid thought about the crowded streets of Bergen, where you could hardly walk 20 feet without encountering someone you knew. "In Bergen, always people everywhere. Sometimes is nice, but sometimes—" She searched for the words. "Sometimes you want quiet too." The ranch house came into view as they crested a small hill, and Astrid felt her first real surge of hope since arriving in America. The building was larger than she had expected. Not grand by any means, but substantial and well-built. It was constructed of logs and stone, with a wide front porch and windows that faced east toward the mountains. Smoke rose from the chimney, and the whole scene had a settled, comfortable appearance that spoke of careful maintenance and genuine pride in ownership. "You built this?" she asked. "Most of it," Caleb replied with obvious satisfaction. "Took me 3 years, working mostly by myself with help from neighbors during the big jobs. The foundation is local stone, and I cut most of the timber from my own land." As they approached the house, Astrid could see the outbuildings that supported the ranch operation: a large barn, several smaller sheds, corrals for the horses, and what appeared to be a chicken coop. Everything was neat and well organized, suggesting that Caleb was a man who took his responsibilities seriously. "Is beautiful," she said sincerely. "You work very hard for this." "I have," he agreed, "and now I hope we can work together to make it even better." Inside, the house was furnished simply but comfortably. The main room featured a large stone fireplace, several chairs, and a dining table that could seat 6 people. The kitchen was well equipped with a cast iron stove, plenty of storage, and a hand pump that brought water directly from the well outside. There were 3 bedrooms, a large one that would obviously be theirs, a smaller one that Caleb explained was for guests, and a tiny room that he suggested could be converted into a nursery if and when the need arose. That last comment made Astrid blush furiously, but she tried to hide her reaction by focusing on examining the kitchen more closely. "You cook?" Caleb asked, noticing her interest in the stove and utensils. "Yes, I cook. In Bergen, all women cook, but I do not know American food so much. In Norway, we eat many fish, some meat, potatoes, cabbage." She trailed off, realizing how limited her diet had been. "Well, we don't have much fish here, being so far from the ocean, but we have plenty of beef and chicken, and I plant a vegetable garden every year. Potatoes, carrots, onions, beans. Maybe you can help me expand it next spring." The idea of planning for next spring, of having a future that extended beyond simple survival, was almost overwhelming. "I would like that very much." As the afternoon wore on, Caleb showed her around the rest of the property, introducing her to the horses and cattle, explaining the daily routines of ranch life, and pointing out landmarks and boundaries. It was clear that he loved this land and was proud of what he had built. But it was also clear that managing it all by himself was a constant challenge. "I get up before dawn to take care of the animals," he explained as they walked through the barn. "Then there's always something that needs fixing, or building, or moving. In summer, there's hay to cut and store for winter feed. In fall, there's cattle to round up and sort. Winter's a bit quieter, but that's when I do most of the repair work and prepare for the next year." "Is very much work for one person?" Astrid observed. "It is," he agreed. "That's one of the reasons I wanted a wife. Not just for companionship, though that's important too, but for partnership. Ranch life works better when there are 2 people sharing the load." As evening approached, they returned to the house, and Astrid began to feel nervous about the night ahead. She had tried not to think too much about the physical aspects of marriage, but now that they were alone in the house where they would presumably share a bed, the reality was becoming unavoidable. Caleb seemed to sense her anxiety. "Astrid," he said gently, "I want you to know that I don't expect, that is, I understand this is all very new and strange for you. We can take things slowly. There's no need to rush into anything you're not ready for." The kindness in his voice brought tears to her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. I do not know the word." "Nervous? Scared?" "Yes, scared. Everything is so different. The language, the food, the land, even the air smells different. And you are—" She struggled to express what she was feeling. "You are stranger, but also husband. I do not know how to be with you." Caleb sat down across from her at the kitchen table. "I'm scared too," he admitted. "I've never been married before. I don't know how to be a husband any more than you know how to be a wife. Maybe we can figure it out together." That evening, they ate a simple dinner that Caleb prepared: beef stew with vegetables from his garden, accompanied by bread that he admitted was store-bought because his baking skills were limited. The food was hearty and filling, though quite different from the fish and root vegetables that had been staples in Bergen. "Tomorrow I can cook," Astrid offered. "I learned to make American food if you teach me." "I'd like that," Caleb said. "And maybe you can teach me some Norwegian dishes too. I'd be curious to try them." After dinner, they sat by the fireplace, and Caleb told her more about the area, which neighbors were friendly, where the nearest town was located, what kind of weather to expect as winter approached. Astrid listened carefully, trying to absorb all the information she would need to build a life in this place. "The winters here are different from what you're used to," Caleb explained. "We can get snowed in for weeks at a time, and the temperature can drop to 20 or 30 below zero. Do you think you'll be able to handle that kind of isolation?" Astrid almost laughed. "Mr. Morrison, Caleb, I am from Bergen. In winter, sometimes we do not see sun for many weeks. Snow is, how do you say, normal thing for me. Cold is normal thing. Maybe American winter will be easier than Norwegian winter." "I hope so," Caleb said, though something in his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. When it came time to retire for the evening, the awkwardness returned. Caleb showed her to the bedroom they would share, though he had already moved a blanket and pillow to the main room. "I'll sleep by the fire tonight," he said. "Give you time to get settled and comfortable. We can work out the other arrangements later, when you're ready." Astrid felt a mix of relief and guilt. This man was being incredibly considerate, but she also knew that their marriage would never be real until they could be comfortable with each other in every way. "Caleb," she said softly, "you are a very kind man. I am lucky to have you for husband." He smiled, the expression transforming his weather-beaten face. "I hope you still feel that way when you know me better." As Astrid lay alone in the large bed that night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the Montana wilderness, the wind in the pine trees, the distant call of coyotes, the settling of the house around her, she thought about how drastically her life had changed in just a few weeks. A month ago, she had been a fisherman's daughter facing starvation in Bergen. Tonight, she was Mrs. Caleb Morrison, mistress of a 640-acre ranch in Montana Territory. She had a warm bed, plenty of food, and a husband who seemed genuinely decent and caring. But she was also thousands of miles from everything familiar, married to a man she barely knew, in a place where she didn't even speak the language properly. The magnitude of what she had undertaken was both thrilling and terrifying. Outside her window, the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of snow from the high mountains. Winter was coming to Montana, and Astrid Larson Morrison was about to discover what survival meant in a land where the nearest neighbor was miles away, and help might not come for months. The first weeks of marriage were a careful dance of accommodation and discovery. Astrid threw herself into learning everything she could about American frontier life, while Caleb patiently taught her ranch routines and introduced her to neighbors who were curious about the Norwegian bride who had appeared so suddenly in their community. The language barrier created constant small challenges. Astrid's English was functional but limited, and she often found herself struggling to express complex thoughts or emotions. Simple conversations about daily tasks were manageable, but deeper discussions about feelings, plans, or past experiences often ended in frustration for both of them. "No, no," she said one morning, trying to explain why she had rearranged the kitchen storage. "In Bergen, we keep dry things, tura ting, away from fra." "Oh, what is word?" "Away from what?" Caleb asked patiently. "Wet. Away from wet things. But not wet, damp, the air that makes things." She gestured helplessly, unable to find the English word for moisture. "Humid?" Caleb suggested. "Yes, humid. We keep flour and sugar away from humid air. But here air is very dry, so maybe different way is better." These linguistic negotiations happen dozens of times each day, turning simple household decisions into complex discussions. But gradually they developed their own system of communication that mixed English words with Norwegian phrases and generous use of gestures and demonstrations. Cooking presented its own challenges. Astrid was an excellent cook by Norwegian standards, but American ingredients and cooking methods were often unfamiliar. Her first attempt at making biscuits resulted in objects that Caleb politely described as dense, while her effort to recreate a traditional fish stew using beef instead of cod was edible but bore little resemblance to either American or Norwegian cuisine. Maybe we learn together, she suggested after another culinary experiment went awry. You teach me American food, I teach you Norwegian food, and we make new food that is both. Caleb seemed charmed by this idea. Fusion cuisine, he said, though I don't think they have a word for it yet. More challenging than language or cooking, however, was the social aspect of fitting into the community. Copper Creek was small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, and the arrival of a foreign mail-order bride was the most interesting thing that had happened in months. Some of the attention was friendly. Mrs. Patterson from the hotel made a point of visiting regularly, bringing small gifts and offering advice about everything from the best places to shop in town to the social customs Astrid needed to understand. Tom Bradley, Caleb's nearest neighbor, and his wife Sarah became regular visitors, and Sarah was particularly helpful in explaining the unwritten rules of frontier social life. The women here are very independent, Sarah explained during one of her visits. Not like in the East, where ladies are expected to be delicate and helpless. Out here, everyone works hard, and everyone's expected to pull their weight. That might be different from what you're used to in Norway. In Bergen, women also work hard, Astrid replied. Fishermen wives work very much. Mend nets, sell fish, take care of house and children. Maybe not so different. But other community members were less welcoming. At the general store, Astrid often felt the weight of curious and sometimes hostile stares. Conversations would stop when she entered, then resume in whispers after she passed. She heard fragments. Foreign girl, mail-order bride, doesn't even speak proper English. That made her cheeks burn with embarrassment. The worst incident happened during her third week in Copper Creek, when she went to town alone for the first time to buy supplies. As she was loading her purchases into the wagon, she overheard two women talking nearby. I still can't believe Caleb Morrison went and got himself a mail-order bride, one of them said. What was wrong with the perfectly good American girls right here? Nothing that a little money couldn't fix, apparently, the other replied, though I hear tell she can barely speak English. What kind of wife is that going to make? Poor man probably doesn't even know what he's gotten himself into. These foreign girls, you never know what kind of strange ideas they have about marriage and family. Astrid stood frozen beside the wagon, her face burning with shame and anger. She wanted to turn around and defend herself, to explain that she was educated and capable and working as hard as she could to fit in. But her English wasn't good enough for that kind of confrontation, and she was afraid that anything she said would only make things worse. Instead, she finished loading the wagon in silence and drove home with tears streaming down her face. Caleb found her an hour later, sitting on the front porch and staring out at the mountains with red-rimmed eyes. What happened? He asked, settling beside her on the wooden steps. People in town, she said simply. They think I am bad wife for you. They think you should marry American girl, not foreign girl who cannot speak good English. Caleb was quiet for a moment, his jaw tightening. Who said that? I do not know names. Two women by the store. But maybe other people think same thing. Astrid, look at me. His voice was gentle but firm. I don't care what other people think about my wife or my marriage. I chose you, and I'm glad I did. You're working harder than anyone to learn our ways and fit in here. Anyone who can't see that isn't worth your concern. His words were comforting, but Astrid still felt the sting of rejection. Maybe they are right. Maybe I am not good wife for American man. You're wrong about that, Caleb said firmly. In the past 3 weeks, you've reorganized my kitchen so it actually makes sense. Cooked meals that are better than anything I've eaten in years. Helped me repair the chicken coop, learned to milk the cow, and managed to communicate with me even when we don't have the right words. If that's not being a good wife, then I don't know what is. That evening, as they worked together to prepare dinner, Astrid found herself thinking about identity and belonging. In Bergen, she had always known exactly who she was, a fisherman's daughter, a member of a specific community with clear rules and expectations. Here she was still figuring out who she was supposed to become. Caleb, she said as they sat down to eat, in America, what does it mean to be American? Not born American, but to become American. He considered this carefully. I think it means different things to different people, But for me, I'd say it means being willing to work hard for what you want, being honest in your dealings with others, and taking responsibility for yourself and your family. It means believing that you can build a better life if you're willing to make the effort. I can do those things, Astrid said quietly. You already are doing those things, Caleb replied. The women who were talking today, they're just scared of anything different. That doesn't make their opinions worth much. As October turned into November, the relationship between Astrid and Caleb began to evolve from polite strangers, sharing a house, to something approaching genuine partnership. They developed routines that played to each other's strengths. Caleb handled the heavy outdoor work and animal care, while Astrid managed the house, garden preservation, and increasingly sophisticated meal preparation. More importantly, they began to communicate more easily, not just about practical matters, but about thoughts and feelings. Astrid's English improved rapidly with constant practice, while Caleb made an effort to learn basic Norwegian phrases that made her feel less isolated. Jeg elsker deg, he said one evening, pronouncing the Norwegian words carefully. Astrid smiled, the first genuine smile he had seen from her in days. You said I love you, but your pronunciation is terrible. Well, teach me to say it right. Jeg elsker deg, she said slowly. But maybe we practice English words too. Love is big word. Maybe we start with like or care about. I care about you, Caleb said in English. Is that a good place to start? Yes, Astrid replied softly. I care about you too. The physical side of their marriage also began to develop naturally, without the pressure or awkwardness that Astrid had feared. Caleb continued to sleep on the sofa for nearly a month, until one cold night when Astrid finally asked him to join her in the bedroom. Not because we must, she said, her cheeks pink with embarrassment, but because I think I am ready to be real wife now, and because it is getting cold, and you will freeze on sofa. Their wedding night, when it finally came, was gentle and patient, and nothing like the frightening experience Astrid had imagined. Caleb was careful with her, considerate of her inexperience, and more interested in her comfort than his own satisfaction. Afterward, as they lay together in the dark, Astrid felt something shift inside her. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of love. Are you sorry you came here? Caleb asked quietly. Astrid considered the question seriously. I miss my family very much, and sometimes I feel very alone, even when you are here. The language, the food, the way people look at me, it is all still strange. But I am not sorry. In Bergen, I would be dead by now, or watching my family die. Here, I have chance to build something. Maybe I will always be Norwegian girl in American place, but maybe that is not so bad. Maybe it's exactly what this place needs, Caleb said, pulling her closer. As November progressed, the weather began to change in ways that reminded Astrid of Bergen winters. The days grew shorter and colder, with frost appearing on the grass most mornings and ice forming on the water troughs. But the landscape remained largely brown and dry, very different from the wet gray winters she was used to. When does snow come? She asked one morning as they watched their breath cloud in the cold air. Usually by December, Caleb replied, though sometimes we get a big storm earlier. And when it does come, it comes fast and heavy. We need to make sure we're ready. They spent the remaining weeks of November preparing for winter in earnest. The garden vegetables were harvested and preserved. The barn was stocked with hay for the animals, and the house was checked and rechecked for any gaps that might let in cold air. Astrid threw herself into the preservation work with an efficiency that impressed Caleb. Clearly, Norwegian women knew something about preparing for hard winters. How much food do we need? She asked as they worked to cure and store the last of the beef they had butchered. Enough for 4 months, Caleb said. Sometimes we can get to town in the winter, but sometimes we can't. It's better to have too much than too little. Astrid nodded, thinking of the careful calculations her mother had made each fall in Bergen, weighing what they could afford to buy against what they might need to survive until spring. In Norway, we say winter is when you find out who really planned and who just hoped. That's a good saying, Caleb agreed, and from what I've seen, you're definitely a planner. By late November, they felt reasonably prepared for whatever the winter might bring. The house was warm and tight, the food stores were ample, and their relationship had developed enough mutual trust and affection that the prospect of being snowbound together for months didn't seem intimidating. But Montana winters, as Astrid was about to learn, had a way of testing even the best-laid plans. The first snow came on December 3rd, starting as light flakes that danced in the morning air, like the promise of something beautiful. Astrid stood on the front porch, watching the white crystals settle on the brown grass, and feeling a deep sense of homecoming she hadn't experienced since leaving Bergen. "Finally," she said to Caleb as he came out to stand beside her, "now it feels like winter." "Don't be too eager," he warned, though he was smiling at her obvious pleasure. "This is just the beginning. Wait until you see what a real Montana blizzard looks like." But for that first week, the snow was everything Astrid had missed about Norwegian winters. It fell steadily but gently, transforming the stark landscape into something soft and peaceful. She taught Caleb how to read the different types of snow: the fine powder that meant more was coming, the heavy wet flakes that would stop soon, the ice crystals that warned of dangerously cold temperatures ahead. "In Bergen, we say snow talks to those who know how to listen," she explained as they walked around the property, checking on the animals and ensuring everything was secure. "This snow says it will be here for a long time, but not angry snow. Patient snow." Caleb listened to her weather predictions with growing respect. Her ability to read the clouds and wind patterns seemed almost supernatural, but it was clearly based on years of experience with serious winter weather. "How did you learn all this?" he asked. "From my father, and his father before him. Fishermen must know weather, or they die. In Bergen, winter weather kills people who do not pay attention." As the days passed and the snow continued to accumulate, their daily routines adapted to the new conditions. Morning chores took longer when they had to break ice on water troughs and shovel paths to the barn. Evening preparations included banking the fire to last through the night and checking that they had enough wood stacked inside to avoid having to go out in the dark. But Astrid thrived in the winter environment in ways that surprised Caleb. While he bundled up in heavy coats and moved carefully through the snow, she seemed to glide across the white landscape with natural grace. She showed him how to walk on snow without sinking, how to read the wind to avoid frostbite, how to layer clothing for maximum warmth without restricting movement. "You're like a different person in the snow," he observed one morning as they finished the chores. "More confident." "Snow is my element," Astrid said simply. "In Bergen, children learn snow before they learn to read. I am more comfortable in winter than any other time." Their relationship, too, seemed to deepen with the arrival of winter. The isolation that had worried Caleb turned out to be a blessing, giving them time to really get to know each other without the distractions and judgments of the outside world. They spent long evenings by the fire, talking about their past lives, their hopes for the future, and their growing feelings for each other. Astrid told him about her childhood in Bergen, the excitement of watching the fishing boats return with their catch, the festivals and traditions that marked the seasons, the close-knit community where everyone looked after everyone else. She described her father with such love and admiration that Caleb found himself wishing he could have met the man who had raised such a remarkable daughter. In return, Caleb shared stories of his own journey west, the dreams that had driven him to leave his family's farm in Ohio and stake a claim in the Montana territory. He told her about the loneliness of building the ranch by himself, the satisfaction of watching cattle and crops thrive under his care, the simple pleasure of owning land that stretched to the horizon. "Why mail-order bride?" Astrid asked one evening as they sat by the fire, her head resting against his shoulder. "Why not marry American girl from town?" Caleb was quiet for a moment, considering how to answer. "I guess I wanted someone who would appreciate what we're building here, instead of always wishing for something different. A lot of the women I met in town, they talked about wanting to go back east to the cities, or complained about how hard frontier life was. I wanted a partner, not someone I'd have to take care of. And Norwegian girl is good partner." "This Norwegian girl is," he said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "You work harder than any woman I've ever known, and you never complain about things you can't change. You just figure out how to make them better." December passed peacefully, with regular snowfall that built up slowly and steadily. Astrid's predictions about the weather proved remarkably accurate. She could tell by the color of the evening sky whether the next day would bring more snow, and she could sense changes in temperature hours before they occurred. "Tomorrow will be very cold," she announced one evening, studying the clear star-filled sky. "Maybe the coldest yet." "How can you tell?" "Too many stars," she said seriously. "When sky is too clear in winter, it means no clouds to hold warmth close to ground. All heat goes up to sky, and cold comes down to us." Sure enough, the next morning dawned with a bitter cold that made the air itself seem to crackle. The thermometer outside the kitchen window read 15 degrees below zero, and even the short walk to the barn left them both gasping from the shock of the frigid air. But it was on December 20th that Montana showed them what a real winter storm looked like. Astrid sensed it coming 2 days before it arrived. The behavior of the animals changed. The horses became restless, pacing in their stalls, while the cattle clustered together in the most sheltered corner of their pasture. The wild birds disappeared entirely, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. "Big storm comes," she told Caleb on the morning of the 18th. "Not tomorrow, but day after. Very big storm." "How big?" Astrid looked at the western sky, where a thin line of gray clouds was barely visible on the horizon. "The kind that kills people who are not ready." They spent the next 2 days in frantic preparation. Extra firewood was stacked inside the house. The barn was checked and reinforced against wind damage. Food and water were brought inside in quantities that would last for days without having to venture outside. They even moved the chickens from their coop into the barn, knowing that the more fragile birds might not survive what was coming. On the morning of December 20th, the storm arrived. It began as increased wind, gusting hard enough to rattle the windows and send loose snow swirling around the buildings. But within an hour, the wind had become a howling monster that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in 2 hours, and the snow began to fall, not in flakes, but in horizontal sheets driven by winds that Caleb estimated at 60 miles per hour or more. By noon, it was impossible to see more than a few feet beyond the windows. The world outside had become a white void, and the sound of the wind was so loud they had to shout to hear each other inside the house. "Jesus," Caleb breathed, staring out at the chaos beyond the glass. "I've never seen anything like this." "This is serious blizzard," Astrid confirmed, though she seemed more excited than frightened. "In Bergen, we call this type storm vindskval, wind scream. Very dangerous, but also very beautiful." As the day wore on, it became clear that this was no ordinary winter storm. The wind continued to build rather than diminish, and the snow accumulated so rapidly that they could watch it rising against the lower window panes. The house itself seemed to shrink under the assault, creaking and groaning as wind pressure tested every joint and corner. But inside their warm kitchen, with plenty of food and fuel for the fire, Astrid seemed completely at ease. She moved around the house, checking windows and doors with the efficiency of someone who had weathered many such storms, while Caleb tried to hide his growing anxiety about the cattle and horses trapped outside in the barn. "The animals will be all right," she assured him, noticing his worried glances toward the door. "Barn is strong, and animals know how to survive cold. Worst thing we could do is try to go outside now." As if to emphasize her point, a particularly strong gust of wind hit the house at that moment, making the entire structure shudder and sending something, probably a loose piece of roofing, clattering across the yard with a metallic screech. "How long will it last?" Caleb asked. Astrid cocked her head, listening to the wind with the concentration of a doctor taking a pulse. 2 days, maybe 3. This storm has much anger to spend." That night, as they lay in bed listening to the continuous roar of wind and the occasional crack of tree branches breaking under the weight of snow, Astrid told Caleb about the worst storm she had ever experienced in Bergen. "I was 12 years old," she said, her voice barely audible above the noise outside. "Storm came from north, very sudden. My father was at sea with other fishermen. For 3 days, no one could leave houses. When storm finished, we found 2 boats smashed on rocks, and 4 men never came home." "Was your father all right?" "Yes, but he said later it was closest he ever came to dying. His boat almost hit rocks too, but wind changed at last moment and pushed them to safety." She was quiet for a moment. "That storm taught me that winter is not just beautiful. Winter can kill, even people who think they understand it." The blizzard raged for 3 full days, just as Astrid had predicted. On the morning of the fourth day, they woke to an eerie silence that seemed almost unnatural after the constant noise of the wind. Caleb rose first and made his way to the kitchen window, then called for Astrid to come see what the storm had left behind. The world outside was transformed beyond recognition. Snow had drifted against the house until it reached halfway up the first-floor windows. The barn was completely buried except for the peak of its roof, and the fences had disappeared entirely under smooth white dunes that stretched as far as they could see. "My God," Caleb breathed, "how are we supposed to get to the animals?" But Astrid was already pulling on her heaviest clothes and boots. "We dig," she said matter-of-factly, "but first we make sure animals are still alive." What followed was the most physically demanding day of Caleb's life. Together they dug a tunnel through 8 feet of snow to reach the barn, then spent hours clearing snow away from the doors and windows to let in light and fresh air. The animals had indeed survived, huddled together for warmth and protected by the solid construction of the building, but they were hungry and thirsty and clearly relieved to see their human caretakers. "How did you know exactly where to dig?" Caleb asked as they finally finished clearing access to the barn. "In Bergen, we learned to read snow like map," Astrid explained. "Wind makes patterns when it blows around buildings. If you know patterns, you can find buried things even when you cannot see them." That evening, exhausted but triumphant, they sat by the fire and assessed their situation. They had plenty of food and fuel, the animals were safe, and the house had weathered the storm without serious damage. But they were also completely cut off from the outside world, with no way to reach town or contact their neighbors until the snow melted or they could dig out enough to make travel possible. "We could be stuck here for weeks," Caleb said. "Good," Astrid replied, surprising him. "Now we can have real Norwegian winter, just us, snow, and time to be together." As if to celebrate her words, the clouds cleared that night to reveal a sky so full of stars it seemed to pulse with light. The snow outside glowed faintly blue in the starlight, and the silence was so complete they could hear each other's breathing. "It's beautiful," Caleb said as they stood together on the porch, wrapped in quilts and marveling at the transformed landscape. "Winter is always beautiful when you are safe inside it," Astrid agreed. "The danger makes the beauty more precious?" "Yes, precious. Because you know it could kill you, but instead it makes everything clean and new." As they stood there in the crystal-clear cold, Caleb realized that something fundamental had changed between them during the storm. They had faced their first real test as a married couple and had come through it not just intact, but stronger. Astrid's competence and confidence in the winter conditions had been a revelation, while his willingness to trust her judgment and follow her lead had surprised them both. "I think I'm falling in love with you," he said quietly. Astrid turned to look at him, her face serious in the starlight. "I think maybe I am falling in love with you too," she replied. "But maybe we should wait until spring to be sure. Winter makes everything feel different." "Fair enough," Caleb agreed. "But I have a feeling spring is just going to confirm what I already know." As they made their way back inside to the warmth of their home, neither of them noticed the lone figure on the horseback watching them from the tree line at the edge of their property. Or if they had noticed, they might have assumed it was just a neighbor checking to make sure everyone had survived the storm. They had no way of knowing that their peaceful winter isolation was about to be shattered by a crisis that would test not just their survival skills, but their commitment to each other and their new life in the unforgiving Montana territory. The knock came at dawn on January 15th, so faint and tentative that Astrid almost missed it over the sound of wind whistling around the eaves. She was in the kitchen, preparing coffee and oatmeal for breakfast, when she heard what might have been knuckles on wood, or might have been ice falling from the roof. She paused, listening intently. There it was again. 3 soft raps, barely audible, but definitely deliberate. "Caleb," she called quietly, not wanting to wake him if she was mistaken. But when the knocking came a third time, she set down her coffee pot and moved toward the front door. Through the frosted window, she could see a dark shape huddled on the porch. Someone wrapped in what appeared to be a blanket, swaying slightly as if struggling to remain upright. "Caleb," she called more urgently, already reaching for the door latch. The man on their porch was barely conscious, his face blue with cold and his lips moving soundlessly. Ice crystals covered his eyebrows and beard. and his hands were wrapped in strips of cloth that were stained with blood. Behind him, a horse stood with its head hanging low, steam rising from its sweat-covered flanks despite the bitter cold. "Help me get him inside," Astrid said as Caleb appeared at her shoulder. Together they half-carried, half-dragged the stranger into their warm kitchen, where they laid him on the floor near the stove. As they began removing his frozen outer garments, Astrid could see that he was a young man, probably not much older than herself, with the kind of soft features that suggested he wasn't accustomed to outdoor work. "What happened to you?" Caleb asked, but the man could only mumble incoherently through chattering teeth. "Hypothermia," Astrid diagnosed, drawing on knowledge gained from too many Bergen winters, where fishing boats returned with half-frozen crews. "We must warm him slow, or we kill him." She moved with the efficiency of someone who had dealt with such emergencies before, directing Caleb to heat water while she wrapped the stranger in dry blankets and began gently massaging his hands and feet to restore circulation. It was dangerous work. Warming someone too quickly could send their cold blood rushing back to their heart and stop it entirely. As the man gradually regained consciousness and the ability to speak clearly, his story emerged in fragments. His name was David Hutchinson, and he was the school teacher from Pine Ridge, a settlement about 30 miles to the north. He had been traveling to visit his sister in Helena when the latest storm caught him unprepared on the mountain trail. "Lost my way in the snow," he explained, his voice still shaky from cold and exhaustion. "Been wandering for 2 days, maybe 3. Horse is about done in. I thought I was going to die out there." "You almost did," Caleb said grimly. "Another hour in this cold and we'd have found you frozen solid." As David's condition improved, they were able to assess the full extent of his situation. Besides the hypothermia, he had severe frostbite on his fingers and toes, and his horse was in even worse condition, exhausted, dehydrated, and showing signs of the respiratory problems that could kill animals exposed to extreme cold for too long. "Horse needs shelter immediately," Astrid said after examining the animal, "but I do not think he can walk to barn." This presented a serious problem. The barn was only 50 yards from the house, but with snowdrifts and bitter wind, it might as well have been 50 miles for an animal in the horse's condition. "We'll have to bring the barn to the horse," Caleb said after considering their options. What followed was an improvised construction project that drew on both Caleb's ranching experience and Astrid's knowledge of emergency shelter building. Using tarps, rope, and lumber from Caleb's workshop, they created a windbreak around the horse that provided immediate protection from the wind while still allowing them to gradually move the animal toward the barn as its condition improved. But it was David Hutchinson's presence that created the most significant change in their winter routine. Suddenly, their cozy isolation was broken by the needs of someone who was completely dependent on their care and hospitality. "I can't thank you enough," David said repeatedly as Astrid treated his frostbite with a mixture of practical medicine and Norwegian folk remedies. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't found me." "You did not find us," Astrid corrected gently. "We just happened to be here when you needed help. In mountains, in winter, this is what people do for each other." David was educated and well-spoken, with a gentle manner that immediately appealed to Astrid. As his health improved, he began to contribute to their daily routines, helping with cooking and household chores while his strength returned. He also brought news from the outside world that they had been cut off from for weeks. "The winter's been brutal all across the territory," he told them, as they sat around the kitchen table one evening. "Whole settlements have been snowed in for months. There's been livestock losses, and some folks have run out of food entirely." "What about Pine Ridge?" Caleb asked. "How are your students managing?" David's expression darkened. "That's what I was trying to get to Helena about. We've got families up there who are in real trouble. The Williamson homestead lost their roof to snow load, and they've been living in the schoolhouse with 3 other families. Food's running low, and there's been talk of trying to make it through to the railroad before the next storm hits." Astrid felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside. "How many people?" 15 adults, maybe 20 children, and at least half of them have never been through a winter like this before. The implications were sobering. A group that large with limited winter experience attempting to travel 30 or 40 miles through mountain snow in the middle of winter would likely face disaster. But staying put without adequate shelter or supplies might be equally dangerous. What kind of help were you hoping to find in Helena? Caleb asked. Supplies, mostly. Food, medicine, maybe some men willing to come back with me to help build temporary shelters. But with the railroad snowed in and most of the passes blocked, David trailed off, the hopelessness of the situation clear in his voice. That night, as they lay in bed listening to David's quiet breathing from the next room, Astrid and Caleb discussed the dilemma in whispers. We can't just ignore it, Astrid said. Those children, they will die if no one helps them. But what can we do? Caleb replied. We're cut off just like everyone else. Even if we could somehow get through to Pine Ridge with supplies, how would we carry enough food for 35 people? Astrid was quiet for a long moment, thinking. In Bergen, she had seen fishing communities pull together during crises, sharing resources and knowledge to ensure everyone survived the harsh seasons. But this situation was different. The distances were greater, the isolation more complete, and the resources more limited. Maybe we cannot bring food to them, she said finally, but maybe we can bring them to food. What do you mean? Our ranch. We have big barn, warm house, plenty of food stored for winter. Maybe we can bring some of the families here until spring comes and they can rebuild. Caleb considered this, weighing the practical challenges against the moral imperative to help. That's a generous thought, but even if we could get word to them, how would they travel that far in these conditions? Some of those children are too young to make that kind of journey. Norwegian way, Astrid said with growing confidence. My father told me stories about mountain rescue in old country. You do not move all people at once. You move strongest first. They help prepare for others. Then you move families with older children. Last, you move most vulnerable. Babies, sick people, old people. When path is made safe and shelters are ready. David, who had apparently been listening from the next room, appeared in the doorway wearing one of Caleb's nightshirts and a hopeful expression. You really think something like that could work? He asked. It would be dangerous, Caleb said, and it would require perfect coordination and a lot of luck with the weather. But Astrid was already developing the idea, drawing on memories of her father's stories about avalanche rescues and winter evacuations in the Norwegian mountains. First, we need to know exactly what conditions are between here and Pine Ridge, she said. David, you came that way. Can you remember the trail? Where are the dangerous places? Where are the sheltered spots? Over the next several hours, they worked together to map out a rescue plan that was audacious in its scope and terrifying in its risks. David sketched the route he had followed, marking the locations of natural shelters, dangerous creek crossings, and areas where the trail was most exposed to wind and weather. Astrid contributed knowledge of winter travel techniques that neither man had ever heard of. How to read snow conditions to predict avalanche danger, how to construct emergency shelters from pine boughs and snow, how to travel safely in whiteout conditions using rope lines and landmark navigation. In Norway, mountain rescue teams use what we call reindeer method, she explained. First person breaks trail through snow, second person carries supplies, third person watches for danger and helps anyone who falls behind. You move slow but steady, and you never leave anyone alone. That works fine for a few people, Caleb pointed out, but we're talking about moving entire families, including small children. Then we modify, Astrid said simply. We make several trips. First trip, strongest men come here and help prepare more shelters. Second trip, women and older children. Third trip, families with babies and anyone too weak for long journey. David looked between them with growing excitement. It could work. The men who came first could help build additional shelters here, and they could also go back to guide the other groups. The families would only need to survive the journey, not the entire rest of the winter. But even as they refined the plan, the magnitude of what they were proposing became clear. They would be risking their own lives, as well as the lives of everyone they were trying to help, on a rescue operation that had never been attempted under such extreme conditions. If we get caught in a storm during one of these trips, Caleb said soberly, people will die. Maybe a lot of people. If we do nothing, Astrid replied, people will die anyway. Maybe all of them. They spent the next 3 days planning in detail, studying the weather patterns, inventorying their supplies, and working out logistics that would make the rescue operation possible. David proved invaluable, not just for his knowledge of the route and the conditions at Pine Ridge, but for his ability to think through the practical challenges of moving large groups of people. The Williamson family has the most children, he reported. 6 kids ranging from 2 years old to 16. They'll need the most help. But Tom Williamson is strong and experienced with winter travel. He could be one of the first group to come here. What about supplies? Caleb asked. We have enough food stored to feed a lot of extra people. But what about bedding, warm clothes, medicine? Astrid had been thinking about this too. We ask each family to bring what they can carry, but we also prepare for people who have lost everything. We have wool blankets. We can make extra bedding from hay and canvas. For medicine, ... She paused, considering. I know some remedies from Bergen for frostbite and fever and breathing problems. Maybe not as good as real doctor, but better than nothing. On January 20th, the weather cleared enough for them to make their first attempt at reaching Pine Ridge. David, whose health had improved dramatically under Astrid's care, would guide them to the settlement, while Caleb and Astrid would assess the situation and present their rescue plan to the stranded families. They traveled on snowshoes that Astrid had improvised from ash wood and leather strapping, following techniques she had learned from her grandfather, who had trapped in the Norwegian mountains. The journey that had taken David days to complete in his desperate, lost condition took them only 8 hours of steady travel. What they found at Pine Ridge was worse than they had expected. The community was barely surviving. The schoolhouse where multiple families had taken shelter was overcrowded and poorly heated, with inadequate ventilation that left everyone breathing stale, smoky air. Several of the children were showing signs of malnutrition, and 2 of the adults had developed respiratory infections that could become deadly without proper treatment. But it was the desperation in people's faces that struck Astrid most forcefully. These were families who had come west with dreams of building better lives, only to find themselves trapped in a nightmare of cold and privation that they had no idea how to escape. We can help, she told the assembled families, speaking slowly and clearly so that everyone could understand her accented English. But it means leaving this place, traveling through snow to our ranch, where there is food and warm shelter for everyone. The initial reaction was skeptical. The idea of attempting a 30-mile journey through deep snow with children and elderly family members seemed impossible to people who were already exhausted and frightened. But Tom Williamson, a grizzled homesteader who had survived previous winters on the frontier, spoke up in support of the plan. I know Caleb Morrison, he said. He's a good man with a solid ranch. And if this Norwegian lady knows winter travel like she says she does, maybe we ought to listen to her. It took hours of discussion, but eventually they worked out the details. The first group, 6 strong men including Tom Williamson, would leave the next morning with Caleb, Astrid, and David. They would help prepare additional shelters at the ranch and then return to guide the families who would follow. We do this in steps, Astrid explained, repeating the plan they had developed. No one travels alone, no one gets left behind, everyone looks after everyone else. It is dangerous, yes, but staying here is also dangerous. The journey back to the ranch with the first group of men was Astrid's debut as a winter rescue leader, and she proved to be a natural. She set a pace that was sustainable but efficient, called rest stops before anyone became too tired, and constantly monitored the group for signs of hypothermia or exhaustion. Most importantly, she demonstrated the kind of calm confidence that kept morale high even when the conditions were challenging. How do you know so much about this? Tom Williamson asked during one of their rest stops, as Astrid checked everyone's hands and feet for signs of frostbite. My father's father was mountain guide in Norway, she explained. He taught my father. My father taught me. In Bergen, everyone must know winter survival, or they do not survive. The men from Pine Ridge worked tirelessly once they reached the ranch, helping Caleb expand the barn into a comfortable shelter for multiple families and constructing additional sleeping areas in the house. Within a week, they had created accommodations that could house 35 people in relative comfort. More importantly, they had proven that the journey between Pine Ridge and the ranch was manageable, even under difficult conditions. The second group, the women and older children, made the trip without serious incident, guided by David and 2 of the men who had made the journey successfully the first time. Astrid remained at the ranch to prepare for their arrival, organizing sleeping arrangements and meal preparations with the efficiency of someone managing a military operation. The final group, the families with babies and anyone too weak for the arduous journey, was the most challenging. But by then, they had established a well-marked trail and staging areas where travelers could rest and warm up if needed. When the last family arrived at the ranch on February 10th, Astrid stood in the yard counting heads and feeling a satisfaction unlike anything she had ever experienced. 35 people who had been facing starvation and freezing were now safe, warm, and fed. "You did it," Caleb said, appearing at her side as the newest arrivals were welcomed into the crowded but cheerful warmth of their expanded home. "We did it," Astrid corrected. "But mostly they did it. They were brave enough to trust strangers and strong enough to save themselves." That night, as she listened to the sounds of multiple families settling in for sleep throughout the house and barn, Astrid reflected on how much her life had changed since arriving in Montana. She had come here as a desperate immigrant, seeking survival for herself and her family. But somehow, in the process of learning to be American, she had also learned to be a leader. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: feeding and housing 35 extra people, managing the complex social dynamics of multiple families living in close quarters, planning for the eventual return to Pine Ridge when spring made rebuilding possible. But tonight, as she lay beside her husband in their warm bed, surrounded by the quiet breathing of people who were alive because she had refused to let them die, Astrid Larson Morrison felt something she had never expected to feel again. She felt proud. The first signs of spring came in early March. Not as warmth, the nights were still brutally cold, but as a change in the quality of the light and the behavior of the animals. The horses began to move restlessly in their stalls, sensing something in the air that their human caretakers couldn't yet detect, and the chickens started laying more eggs despite the continued cold. Astrid noticed these changes before anyone else, drawing on instincts developed through 19 Norwegian springs. She announced at breakfast one morning that winter's back had been broken, even though snow still covered the ground and ice still formed on the water troughs each night. "How can you tell?" asked Mary Williamson, Tom's wife, who had become one of Astrid's closest friends among the Pine Ridge refugees. "Birds," Astrid said simply, pointing toward the kitchen window where a pair of ravens were performing an elaborate courtship dance in the bare branches of a cottonwood tree. "In Bergen, we say when ravens begin to court, spring is coming whether she is ready or not." The past 2 months of communal living had transformed the Morrison Ranch into something resembling a small village. The barn had been converted into comfortable family quarters, with canvas partitions providing privacy and small wood stoves, keeping each section warm. The main house accommodated the single men and the families with the smallest children, while everyone shared common areas for cooking and socializing. It hadn't always been easy. 37 people living in close quarters during a harsh winter created inevitable tensions and conflicts. There had been arguments over food allocation, disputes about child discipline, and the kind of personality clashes that arise when privacy becomes a luxury. But Astrid's natural leadership abilities, combined with her genuine care for everyone's well-being, had helped mediate most conflicts before they became serious problems. More importantly, the shared hardship had created bonds of mutual dependency and respect that transcended the normal social barriers of frontier life. The Pine Ridge families had learned to see Astrid not as a foreign oddity, but as the person whose knowledge and courage had saved their lives. In return, they had helped her understand American customs and social expectations in ways that made her feel more truly at home than she had since leaving Bergen. "You know," Mary Williamson said one evening as they worked together to prepare dinner for the entire group, "when David first told us about you, some folks were skeptical about taking advice from a foreign woman. But I don't think any of us could have managed what you did this winter." Astrid, who was teaching several of the older children how to make Norwegian flatbread, smiled at the compliment. "In Bergen we have saying, winter shows who is strong and who only thinks they are strong. This winter, I think we all found out we are stronger than we knew." As March progressed and the days grew noticeably longer, conversations increasingly turned to the future. The Pine Ridge families would need to return to their settlement eventually to rebuild and prepare for the next winter. But they would also need to decide whether to try to recreate what they had lost or to build something better. "I've been thinking," Tom Williamson said during one of the evening discussions that had become a regular feature of their communal life. What we had at Pine Ridge before the winter, scattered homesteads spread out over miles, that was part of what made this crisis so bad. When trouble came, we couldn't help each other. "What are you suggesting?" asked David Hutchinson, who had essentially moved into the Morrison Ranch for the duration and was showing no signs of wanting to leave. "I'm suggesting we build different," Tom replied. "Closer together. More like a real town where people can look after each other." This sparked a debate that continued for weeks, touching on everything from property rights to social organization to the practical challenges of frontier life. But gradually, a consensus emerged around the idea of creating a more cooperative community that would be better able to withstand future crises. Astrid found herself playing an increasingly central role in these discussions, not just because of her role in the rescue operation, but because her background gave her a different perspective on how communities could be organized. In Norway, she explained during one particularly intense planning session, many villages work together for big projects, building roads, sharing equipment, helping when someone has troubles. Not everyone owns everything separate. Some things better to own together. These conversations were taking place against the backdrop of an important personal development for Astrid and Caleb. The crisis had accelerated the growth of their relationship in ways that might have taken years under normal circumstances. Working together to save lives had created a bond of trust and mutual respect that went far beyond what either of them had expected from their marriage contract. More practically, the constant presence of other people in their home had forced them to develop new ways of communicating and relating to each other. They had learned to have entire conversations with glances and gestures, to provide emotional support during stressful moments without words, and to coordinate complex tasks with the kind of seamless teamwork that usually took years to develop. "I think I love you," Caleb said one evening as they walked together through the snow to check on the animals, taking advantage of a rare moment of privacy. "You think?" Astrid replied with a smile. "After all this, you are still not sure?" "I'm sure I love you," he corrected. "What I'm not sure about is whether you're ready to hear it." Astrid stopped walking and turned to face him in the moonlight. "Caleb Morrison, I traveled across an ocean to marry a stranger because I thought it was my only chance to save my family. I have cooked for 40 people every day for 2 months. I have delivered a baby in a snowstorm, and I have guided families through mountain blizzards without losing a single person. You think I am not ready to hear that my husband loves me?" "When you put it that way," Caleb said, pulling her into his arms, "I guess you're probably tough enough to handle it." "I love you too," she said, her accent making the English word sound exotic and musical. "I think I have loved you since the night you trusted me about the big storm coming. But I wanted to be sure it was not just, what is word, gratitude? Gratitude? Yes. I wanted to be sure I loved Caleb the man, not just Caleb who gave me safe home." Their kiss was interrupted by the sound of Tom Williamson's voice calling from the house. "Caleb, Astrid, come quick. Sarah's baby is coming." The birth of Sarah Peterson's son, the first child born at the Morrison Ranch, became a symbol of new beginnings for the entire community. Astrid served as midwife, drawing on knowledge she had gained from assisting at births in Bergen, while the other women provided support and encouragement. When little James Peterson made his entry into the world on March 20th, the assembled family celebrated as if he were everyone's child. In a way, he was the first member of a new generation that would grow up knowing that community and cooperation were essential for survival on the frontier. "Look at that," Mary Williamson said, as they watched Astrid gently clean and examine the newborn. "Norwegian midwife, American baby, frontier family. If that's not what this country is about, I don't know what is." As April arrived and the snow finally began to melt in earnest, the practical work of planning the return to Pine Ridge began in earnest. But it would not be a simple matter of going back to the way things had been before the crisis. Inspired by Astrid's suggestions and guided by the lessons learned during their months of cooperative living, the families had decided to rebuild Pine Ridge as a more intentionally communal settlement. Individual families would still have their own homes and claims, but they would be built closer together and would share certain facilities, a large community kitchen for special occasions, a common workshop for major construction projects, and a communal storage facility for emergency supplies. Most importantly, They would build with winter in mind from the beginning, creating structures and systems that could keep everyone safe and fed, even during the worst weather. "What about you two?" Tom Williamson asked Caleb and Astrid during one of the final planning meetings. "Will you consider moving to Pine Ridge when we rebuild? We could use your leadership and Astrid's winter expertise." It was a tempting offer. The sense of community and shared purpose that had developed during the crisis had been deeply satisfying for both of them. But as they discussed it privately, they realized that their future lay elsewhere. "I love the ranch," Astrid said as they walked through their own property, looking at the land they had worked so hard to improve. "And I love what we have built here together. Maybe it is selfish, but I want to keep building it. Just us." "It's not selfish," Caleb replied. "And besides, there's something else to consider." "What?" "Your family in Bergen. We've been talking about bringing them to America for months, but we've been so focused on getting through the winter that we haven't made concrete plans. Maybe it's time to do something about that." The idea of finally reuniting with her family had never stopped being important to Astrid, but it had taken a back seat to more immediate survival concerns. Now, with spring coming and their own situation stable, it was time to turn that dream into reality. "You would really want them here?" she asked. "My mother is sick. My brothers and sister are young and do not speak English. It would be much work for you." "For us," Caleb corrected. "And yes, I want them here. I want to meet the people who raised the woman I married. I want to see your mother get well in our dry climate, and I want to watch your siblings grow up American while still remembering their Norwegian." Over the next several weeks, as the Pine Ridge families prepared for their departure and return to their settlement, Astrid and Caleb worked on plans to bring the Larson family to Montana. It would require careful coordination, arranging passage, ensuring they had proper documentation, preparing adequate housing, and saving enough money to support additional family members until they could become self-sufficient. But it would also represent the completion of Astrid's transformation from desperate mail-order bride to established American frontier woman with the resources and connections to help others follow the path she had pioneered. The departure of the Pine Ridge families in early May was both celebration and melancholy farewell. Friendships had been forged during the winter that would last for years, and the experience of working together to survive extreme conditions had created bonds that went far beyond ordinary neighborly relationships. "You'll come visit us when the new town is built?" Mary Williamson asked as she hugged Astrid goodbye. "Of course," Astrid promised, "and you must come here whenever you need help with anything. That is what community means. Even when we do not live in the same place, we still care for each other." David Hutchinson was the last to leave, having delayed his departure as long as possible. His experience during the winter had convinced him that his future lay not in returning to his quiet life as a small-town school teacher, but in helping to build the kind of cooperative community that had been envisioned for the new Pine Ridge. "I want to thank you both," he said, as he prepared to mount his horse for the journey north. "What you did this winter, it wasn't just about saving lives. You showed us that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they worked together." "You saved your own lives," Astrid replied. "We just showed you that it was possible." As they watched the last of their winter guests disappear over the ridge toward Pine Ridge, Astrid and Caleb found themselves alone together on their ranch for the first time in months. The silence felt strange and almost empty after the constant activity and conversation of communal living. "Do you miss them already?" Caleb asked, taking her hand as they stood on the porch watching the sunset. "Yes," Astrid admitted, "but I think I miss the feeling more than the people. The feeling of being needed, of using all my strength and knowledge for something important." "Well," Caleb said with a smile, "I have a feeling you're going to have plenty more opportunities for that. This is the frontier. There's always someone who needs help, and there's always another crisis waiting just over the horizon." "Good," Astrid said, surprising him with her enthusiasm. "I came to America to build new life, but I did not know the new life would be helping other people build their lives too. I like it." That evening, as they sat by the fire in their quiet house and made detailed plans for bringing her family to Montana, Astrid reflected on the extraordinary year that had brought her from the fish markets of Bergen to the cattle ranches of Montana Territory. She had come to America as mail-order bride, expecting nothing more than survival and the hope of eventual security. Instead, she had found love, community, purpose, and the kind of life that allowed her to use all of her capabilities and knowledge in service of something meaningful. Next winter, she said to Caleb as they prepared for bed, when my family is here and we are all together, maybe we can help other families too. Maybe we make Morrison Ranch Place where people come when they need help surviving winter. A refuge, Caleb agreed. I like that idea. Astrid Morrison's Winter Refuge. Our winter refuge, she corrected, but she was smiling as she said it. Outside their bedroom window, the last of the winter snow was melting into streams that would feed the spring grass and eventually the summer gardens. Soon, letters would be sent to Bergen, arranging for passage for the Larson family. Soon, new challenges would arise that would test their courage and resourcefulness in different ways. But tonight, as Astrid lay beside the husband she had learned to love through shared hardship and mutual respect, she felt something she hadn't experienced since childhood. The confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are and where you belong. She was Astrid Larson Morrison, Norwegian-American, frontier woman, and keeper of a home where anyone could find safety from the storm. And that was more than enough. This story of Astrid's journey from the fishing ports of Bergen to the cattle ranches of Montana reminds us that love isn't just something that happens to us. It's something we build, day by day, choice by choice, through the small acts of courage that define who we are when everything familiar falls away. If Astrid's transformation from frightened mail-order bride to confident frontier leader inspired you, if her winter rescue operation showed you the power of knowledge passed down through generations, or if her growing love story with Caleb proved that the strongest marriages are built on partnership and mutual respect, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever had to start over in a completely new place? What would you have done if you were facing Astrid's choice between staying in poverty or risking everything for the unknown? And what traditions from your own heritage have helped you survive difficult times? These stories matter because they remind us that the courage to leave everything behind for something better is the same courage that built America. One family, one choice, one act of faith at a time. Don't forget to hit that like button if Astrid's winter survival skills amazed you. And subscribe to Wild West Stories for more tales of ordinary people doing extraordinary things on the American frontier. Ring that notification bell so you never miss a story about love, courage, and the unbreakable bonds that form when people choose to face the unknown together. Your support helps us keep telling these important stories, these reminders that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the most practical arrangements, and sometimes the strongest communities are built by strangers who choose to become family. Until next time, remember, home isn't just where you're from, it's where you choose to build something worth fighting for. Thank you for watching Wild West Stories, where every tale reminds us that the human heart is stronger than any winter, and love always finds a way to grow, even in the harshest soil.